I'm Nora Whitman, 33 years old, and on a cold November night, I sat at a dining table that never seemed to have a chair with my name on it, fingers resting on the stem of a wine glass while the room swelled with laughter. That wasn't for me. My sister's voice carried polished and bright. My brother's jokes drew the easy smiles, and I studied the amber light skimming the silverware, the way I used to study floor plans looking for the place I might fit if I shifted 1 inch to the left. It would have been simpler to keep my head down, to nod at the stories I'd heard a dozen times, to pretend I didn't feel the weight of what I was about to say. Instead, I counted my breaths, tasted cranberry and clove on the rim of the glass, and let my eyes travel past the centerpiece to a door I knew by heart, even from another city, a heavy wooden door on a quiet Boston street. I could still smell lavender tucked in dresser drawers, hear a piano slightly out of tune, see sunlight falling in squares across a painted floor. Before that night was over, I would choose a different seat at a very old table. And once I did nothing, and this family would sit the way it used to. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when it would have been easier to stay quiet, tap like and subscribe. So this story finds the people who need it. I grew up in a house where success had a volume knob, and someone else always controlled it, where praise rang out for perfect report cards and varsity goals, and the rest of us learned to keep our triumphs small. My mother, Carol, believed in tidy appearances and polished introductions. My father, Tom, favored plans that matched his own, and if they didn't, he called them detours best avoided. Lauren was the headline honors internships, the kind of smile relatives bragged about. Tyler was the promise big ideas, second chances a mess forgiven because he's still young. I was steady where they were loud, the child who colored in the margins and didn't ask for more space than she was given. There was one place the sound softened. My grandmother, June Alder, lived in a weathered 2-story on a maple-lined street outside Boston, the kind of house that knew how to hold a season. In late September, the air inside turned warm with cinnamon and butter, and the old piano in the front room let out a mellow wobble when she pressed a key. She kept sunflower seeds in an envelope by the sink and ledger paper in a drawer, showing me how a garden finds light if you give it a chance, and how a budget keeps you brave when you don't have a safety net. Sitting on her porch, I learned to notice things. Other people stepped past the tilt of a picture frame, the way afternoon sun moves across a floor like a slow tide. June didn't clap for outcomes. She nodded at effort, asked what I saw, and waited for the answer, as if my eyes might bring something new into the room. By the time I finished school and found my way to Chicago, I understood the difference between a room you decorate and a room that lets you breathe. I rented a 3rd-floor walk-up in Lincoln Park with a view of bare branches and brick, furnished it with a thrifted sofa and a desk I assembled myself, and took the kind of job that keeps the lights on while you dream bigger. During the day, I drew clean lines on aging floor plans, finding modern lives inside old bones. At night, I picked up small projects, cafes, corner bakeries, trading sleep for savings, and a sense that my future would be built, not granted. The money never felt like much, but it was mine. Rent paid on time, an index fund set to grow a little at a time, a note on the fridge that said, "Keep going." Holidays made the contrast plain. On my birthday, a brief text. At Christmas, the conversation slid toward Lauren's clients and Tyler's next venture, and if someone remembered to ask about me, it sounded like a checkmark work. Okay, before the topic drifted back to louder shores, I learned how to be gracious without offering my throat, how to listen without vanishing. When the city pressed too hard, I closed my eyes and walked the rooms of June's house fingerprints on a banister flower dust, catching light, a window sticking in the first week of October, the simple hush of being seen without performing. That memory felt less like nostalgia and more like a compass. What anchored me were the values. June tucked into ordinary days, keep your books straight, keep your word, and keep a key to your own front door no matter how small that door is to start. She taught me that dignity isn't loud, it's reliable, that kindness counts even when no one writes it down, and that a woman can choose her own measurements for a life, feet of kitchen counter inches of morning light, miles between what hurts and where you heal. Those lessons turned into habits I didn't have to think about until the day I needed them, when the past reached across the map and put a hand on my shoulder. It happened on a weekday afternoon. I barely remember, except for the way a simple ring lit up my phone and stopped the room. The call took me back to Boston in one breath. Porch boards that creaked on the third step, sunflowers turned toward a pale sky, a house that held its ground through winter storms. I stood by the window with a pencil still in my hand and listened to words I wasn't ready for, words that made the little apartment feel suddenly too bright and too quiet at the same time. By the time the line went dead, the floor plan on my desk no longer looked like lines and numbers. It looked like a door I was going to have to open. The call came from my mother. Her tone was clipped, as though she were reading from a list. "Your grandmother passed away this morning," she said. No pause, no softness, just words suspended in the air between us. I stood in the middle of my drafting room, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, and for a long moment I couldn't breathe. My grandmother, the only person who ever made me feel seen, was gone. I asked about the arrangements about when the service would be held, but my mother only said, "We'll let you know," before hanging up. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gray clouds outside. I finished the rest of that day in a blur. Every drawing, every line, every measurement blurred together until I finally set my pen down. I should have been on the first flight to Boston, standing in that familiar house with the scent of cinnamon and lavender still clinging to the walls. But flights booked at the last minute were expensive, and my savings had gone to rent and bills. I called my father, hoping he'd understand that maybe they could help me cover part of the cost. His reply was quick and cold. "You're an adult now, Nora. If it matters to you, figure it out." Then the line went dead. That night I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, waiting for a text that never came. Finally, I messaged my mother again, asking if the family could help just this once. Her response arrived minutes later. "We're all grieving, Nora. Don't make this about you." I stared at the words until they blurred, then placed the phone face down and let it ring when my sister called an hour later. The voicemail she left was brief. "The funeral was this morning. You don't need to come. Everyone's exhausted." I listened to it twice, unable to believe what I was hearing. They'd held the service without me. They hadn't even given me the chance to say goodbye. I sat there in the half-dark, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, and realized they hadn't just forgotten me, they'd chosen to erase me. By the next morning, the apartment felt unbearably small. I tried to lose myself in work, but nothing stuck. Every task felt hollow, every conversation shallow. When a coworker asked why I looked so tired, I said I'd been working late. I couldn't explain the ache that had settled in my chest, or the way the world had shifted overnight. I went home that evening, turned on the lamp in the corner, and looked at the framed photograph on my desk. June and me, standing on her porch, the sun low behind us. I remembered her voice that summer when I was 12, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You notice what others miss, Nora. That's your gift. Don't let anyone make you forget it." A few days later, I called my mother again, not to plead, just to understand. She sighed as if my name itself were an inconvenience. "There's no need to dwell on it," she said. "You weren't in the will. The house belongs to your father and me now. It's better this way, simpler." I stood still, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. "But she told me," I started, but she cut me off. "You chose your own life, Nora. You moved away. Don't involve yourself in family matters anymore." The words landed like stones. I'd expected distance, but not finality. They'd taken the only place I'd ever belonged and folded it into their names as though I had never existed. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet again, feeling the strange calm that comes after too much pain. I didn't cry right away. It was as if my tears had burned out somewhere between anger and disbelief. In the days that followed, I moved on autopilot. I went to work, came home 8 when I remembered. Nights were the hardest. The city would settle into its hush, and I'd lie awake, picturing the empty wooden house, the pale curtains June had sewn herself, the chipped blue paint on the porch railing, the sound of her laughter floating through the kitchen. That house had been more than wood and walls. It had been proof that I was loved. Now it belonged to people who saw it only as an asset, a line item to trade or sell. At the office, my coworkers spoke about weekend plans, concerts, and family visits. I smiled where appropriate, nodded at the right moments, but I felt detached from everything around me. When I closed my eyes, I saw June's handwriting loopy and neat on the letters she used to send me. Keep your chin up, keep your kindness, the rest will follow. I'd saved every one of them in a small box under my bed, and that week I read them over and over until the paper edges softened under my fingers. Eventually, I stopped waiting for calls from home. The silence became familiar, almost comforting. My parents' voices had always carried more judgment than warmth anyway. Still, the knowledge of what they'd done lingered like a bruise. They hadn't just sold the house, they'd rewritten the story of who mattered. They'd chosen the simplest way forward, as my mother had said, by pretending I'd never been part of the picture. By spring, I threw myself into work with a kind of quiet obsession. I took on extra projects, volunteered for late nights, anything to fill the hours. My apartment changed too, new books on the shelf, sketches taped to the wall, little signs that life was still moving, even if my heart lagged behind. The first paycheck that felt substantial, I put into savings, telling myself I was building something lasting. Independence was the only inheritance I trusted now. Yet no matter how far I tried to move from it, the memory of June's house stayed close. Some nights, when the wind off the lake rattled the windows, I'd imagine standing again in her garden sunflowers, bending under their own height, her voice humming an old tune. I'd picture the way she'd set 2 plates on the porch table, one for her, one for me, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to make space for someone's presence. That memory kept me grounded when everything else felt uncertain. The first holiday season without her came quickly. Snow gathered on the window ledge, the city lights blinking gold against the dark. My parents didn't call, not even a text from Lauren or Tyler. I baked a small pumpkin pie that tasted almost right and brought a slice to the elderly couple down the hall, who always left their door cracked open to the smell of cinnamon. Their quiet gratitude reminded me of June's small gestures, the way she'd slip a cookie into my hand before bed or hum softly as she folded laundry. Kindness had been her language, and I decided to keep speaking it even if no one in my family could understand. But underneath the rhythm of new routines, there was a restlessness I couldn't shake. I had walked away from their indifference, but something about the way they'd spoken of June's will kept tugging at me. You weren't in it, my mother had said, as though that could erase a lifetime of summer afternoons and late-night conversations. I didn't have proof, only memories yet. Those memories felt stronger than any paper they might wave in front of me. I kept telling myself to let it go, that peace meant distance, but some nights the thoughts circled back, quiet but insistent. June had once promised me, "When the time comes, this house will be yours. You'll know what to do with it." I had believed her. And if I knew anything about my grandmother, it was that she meant what she said. By the time another fall rolled around, that uneasy feeling had become part of me. I had moved on, or at least I thought I had, until the past found a new way to knock on my door. One message, a few unexpected words, and everything I'd tried to bury began to stir again. It started with a friend from Boston and a line that made my heart stop. "I just drove past your old street. Your grandma's house has a for sale sign out front." The message came in the middle of a workday, a short line of text from Paula Kent, the neighbor who used to live next door to my grandmother. "Just drove past your old street. Your grandma's house has a for sale sign." My breath caught before I could even finish reading. For a second, the office around me disappeared, the hum of printers, the scratch of pencils, the low music someone kept too loud in their earbuds. All I could see was that house on Maple Street, its porch half hidden behind sun-bleached hydrangeas. I opened my laptop, typed the address into a real estate website, and there it was, a photo of June's house sitting in the middle of a digital listing. The words "Charming historic property needs updating" written below. The white paint was peeling, the shutters sagged, and the porch railing leaned slightly where I used to sit with her on summer evenings. Even through a screen, the sight made my throat tighten. Without thinking, I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and unbothered. "Oh, Nora. Yes, we decided to sell. It's been empty long enough. Really, it's just a burden." I gripped the phone tighter. "A burden," I repeated quietly. She sighed. "You never cared about it anyway. You have your own life now. This will make things easier for everyone." I wanted to ask what everyone meant, but she had already started talking to someone else in the background. "We're at the realtor's office, sweetheart. I'll call you later." Then the line went dead. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the lamplight stretching across the blank surface, and tried to imagine strangers walking through June's rooms. They would open the closet where she kept her wool coats, run their hands along the banister she had sanded herself, and never know the smell of cinnamon that used to linger long after her baking cooled. My mother's words kept circling back just a burden. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something quieter, heavier. For years I had stayed silent, believing it was easier not to stir conflict. But that night, silence felt like surrender. I opened the laptop again and looked up the brokerage listed on the sign in the photo. My hands were steady, my voice even as I left a message. "This is M. Alder. I'm interested in scheduling a showing for the Maple Street property." Using my grandmother's last name felt strange and protective at the same time, like wrapping myself in one of her old scarves. I sent the email and sat there listening to the faint sounds of the city outside, horns of sirens somewhere far away, the whistle of the train that cut through the night. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, only that I had to see that house before it disappeared into someone else's hands. 2 days later, the agent called back. Her name was Renee, and she spoke briskly as if time itself charged by the minute. "You're in luck," she said. "The sellers are eager to move quickly. We can meet Friday morning." I booked the earliest flight to Boston I could find, packed one small suitcase, and took the next 2 days off under the vague excuse of personal business. When the plane touched down, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of weather that smells faintly of salt and rain. I rented a small car and drove through streets that looked both familiar and foreign. The closer I got to Maple Street, the slower I drove until the tires whispered over the pavement. Then I saw it the house, older now, tired, but unmistakably hers. The porch steps groaned under my shoes. The air carried the faint scent of damp leaves and wood. Renee greeted me with professional enthusiasm, turning her key in the lock as she talked about great bones and modern potential. But when the door opened, her voice faded. The smell hit me first, dust mixed with something softer like lavender that refused to leave. My eyes moved from the faded wallpaper to the empty coat hooks and the worn edge of the stair rail polished by June's hand. I walked through the rooms without saying much. The living room was smaller than I remembered, but the light still pooled in the same corner near the piano. The keys were covered in dust, yet when I brushed one with my fingertip, a faint sound echoed through the hollow house. Renee was still talking, renovation costs, neighborhood value, but her words drifted past me like distant wind. Upstairs, the air was cooler. I paused by the window of my old guest room, the one that had overlooked the garden. The patch of soil below was dark and bare now, but in my mind I saw rows of sunflowers nodding in the breeze, bright faces turning toward the light. I didn't take pictures. I didn't need to. Every corner of that house was already burned into my memory. Back downstairs, I thanked Renee and told her I'd be in touch soon. When I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hit my lungs like a jolt of clarity. I knew then what I had to do. If I hesitated, someone else would buy it, and the last piece of June's world would vanish. That evening, I sat in a hotel room near the harbor, the contract papers spread across the desk. I had already set up a small holding company months before a precaution for some freelance investments, but now it would serve a different purpose. Bennett Street Holdings, registered quietly in Illinois, would become the buyer. The funds I'd saved over years of extra projects and careful planning were enough to meet the asking price. I signed every line without flinching. By midnight, it was done. My name wasn't anywhere on the public record, but the deed was secure. I closed the folder, leaned back in the chair, and stared out the window at the flicker of city lights reflected in the dark water. I didn't feel triumphant, only steady as if a long-held breath had finally left my body. The house was safe. The next morning I walked one last time down Maple Street. A faint mist clung to the air curling around the rooftops. I stood at the edge of the garden and pressed my hand to the porch rail, the wood cool under my fingers. I brought it home. June. I whispered, my voice low. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet shift from loneliness to something close to peace. When I returned to Chicago, I carried the signed papers in my bag, folded neatly between project sketches. Work resumed, deadlines waited, but part of me was already looking ahead to Thanksgiving. My parents always hosted, turning the evening into a parade of appearances, silver candlesticks, expensive wine, laughter, rehearsed for show. This year, I would attend. I could already picture the way my mother's eyes would shine when she bragged about selling the old burden, and how my sister would nod approvingly. I rehearsed the moment in my head calm and measured no trace of bitterness. When they finally announced their big news, I'd raise my glass and tell them the truth, not to gloat, but to reclaim what was mine. "Hope you enjoy the money," I'd say, because the buyer was me. Until then, I would stay silent and let the surprise ripen. For the first time in my life, the silence would belong to me. Thanksgiving arrived sooner than I expected, and the drive to my parents' house in the Boston suburbs felt longer than it should have. The sky had that dull silver look it gets before winter settles in, and the air carried a chill that reached through my coat. Their neighborhood looked just as it had for years. Tidy lawns, glowing porch lights, wreaths already hanging, even though November wasn't done. I parked by the curb and sat for a moment, breathing through the tension that had started days before I ever packed my bag. Inside, the familiar hum of conversation and laughter rolled through the house. My mother's voice floated from the kitchen, sharp and cheerful, giving orders like she was directing a stage play. My father was in the living room, already in his best sweater, glass of wine in hand. They were both exactly as I remembered, poised, comfortable, practiced. When I stepped through the doorway, they looked surprised for a heartbeat, then smiled as if my arrival was nothing more than a pleasant footnote. "Well, there's our Nora," my mother said, brushing her hands on a towel. "You made it after all." My father nodded. "Good timing. We're just sitting down." The dining room shimmered under the soft light of the chandelier. The tablecloth was cream, the china polished the silver, perfectly aligned. At the head sat Lauren, flawless as always, her dark blue dress pressed, her hair curled just right. Beside her, Tyler poured wine, grinning at something he'd said. I slipped into a seat near the end of the table, quietly unfolding my napkin, while the noise carried on around me. Dinner began the way it always did. Stories, small boasts, polite laughter. Lauren spoke about a new client her law firm had landed, and my parents leaned forward, nodding with pride. "She's always had a head for the big leagues," my father said, beaming. Then it was Tyler's turn, talking animatedly about his latest business idea. "This one's going to work," he said, tapping the table for emphasis. My mother reached over, patting his arm. "You've got a good mind, sweetheart. It'll come together." I took small bites, smiled where I was supposed to, and let the words drift past me. They didn't ask about my work or how I'd been settling back into city life. I wasn't surprised anymore. I'd learned long ago that my quiet successes didn't fit their stories. Still, there was a strange calm in knowing what to expect. I had rehearsed this night in my mind, every laugh, every dismissal, every word I would eventually say. When dessert was brought out, the air in the room shifted. My mother carried the pumpkin pie like it was part of a ceremony, placing it in the center of the table. She smiled, a knowing little expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. I almost forgot to tell everyone she began pausing for effect. We finally sold Mom's old house on Maple Street. The clinking of silverware stilled. My father leaned back satisfied. "Took long enough, but it's done," he said. "We got a fair offer. It'll make things easier." My mother nodded. "And Nora, you weren't in the will anyway, so it's not something you need to worry about." She said it lightly, as if she were reminding me not to forget my coat on the way out. Lauren laughed, a quick, sharp sound that hit harder than it should have. "Good," she said. She wouldn't have known what to do with it. Tyler chuckled under his breath, adding, "Yeah, probably would have turned it into a workshop or something." I set my fork down and picked up my glass instead. The wine caught the light deep red against the crystal rim. I could feel my heartbeat in the tips of my fingers, but my face stayed calm. I looked from one face to the next, my parents, Lauren, Tyler, and let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle. Then I said quietly but clearly, "Hope you enjoy the money because the buyer was me." The sound that followed wasn't silence exactly. It was the kind of stillness that comes when a storm stops just before breaking. My mother's smile froze in place. My father blinked as if the words didn't quite make sense. Lauren's face went red, her posture stiffening while Tyler stared down at his plate, the humor draining from his features. "What did you just say?" my mother asked, her voice brittle. "I bought the house," I said simply, "through my own company. No one helped me. I wanted to keep it in the family, and I did." For a long moment no one spoke. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Finally my father cleared his throat. "That's impossible," he said. "We sold it to an investor." I met his eyes. "Yes, you did." The quiet that followed was thicker than anger. My mother dropped her spoon. It clattered against the plate, a small sound that filled the space where their laughter used to be. Lauren shook her head, her voice rising. "You bought it just to make us look bad." "No," I said. "I bought it because it mattered. Because she mattered." My mother pushed back her chair. "You humiliated us," she said, her voice trembling with anger that she was trying to hide. "At our own table in front of everyone." I stood slowly smoothing the napkin beside my plate. "No," I said again, softer this time. "I just told the truth." No one stopped me when I reached for my coat. The air outside felt cold and clean compared to the heavy quiet I'd left behind. I walked to my car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, and sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. By morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts from my mother and father stacked one after another, each one angrier than the last. "You embarrassed this family. You had no right. You've torn us apart for nothing." Lauren's message came next. "You think you won, but Grandma would be ashamed of you." I didn't answer any of them. I read each one until the words blurred, then set the phone face down on the table. The only message that gave me pause came from Tyler. "Nora, I know last night got ugly. Mom and Lauren said too much. Honestly, I'm glad you have the house. It's better that it stays with you. Let's talk soon." I stared at his message for a while before typing back, "Thanks, but there's nothing to fix." Then I deleted the thread. That afternoon, I walked along the river near my apartment. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the leaves crunched under my shoes. The anger that had burned through me the night before had cooled into something steadier. I thought of June's words of how she once told me that light always finds its way through the cracks. I'd spent years waiting for them to see me to acknowledge the part of the family I'd always been. But that night at the table had made one thing clear: I didn't need their permission anymore. Back home, I opened my grandmother's old ledger, the one she'd taught me to balance when I was 16. Between the pages was a small note she had written years earlier. "Keep what's worth keeping and build around it." I ran my thumb along the fading ink and felt a calm I hadn't known in a long time. The following week, I decided to take a few days off. I booked a train back to Boston, not to visit them, but to visit the house. I wanted to see it again in the daylight, to feel the air around it, to remind myself why I'd fought for it. As the train sped north through fields dusted with frost, I looked out the window and thought of all the years I had spent trying to belong to a family that never looked back. Now, for the first time, I was returning on my own terms. When the train pulled into South Station, the city felt familiar again, the mix of cold wind and salt air, the sound of old brick streets underfoot. I stepped outside, adjusting my scarf, and whispered to myself, "All right, June, let's begin." The morning after Thanksgiving, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Each message was some version of anger, guilt, or accusation. My mother's text came first, long, furious paragraphs about how I had disgraced them in front of the family. My father's words followed clipped and cold, accusing me of exploiting a loophole. Lauren's message stung the most. "Grandma would be disappointed you used her memory for revenge." I read them all in silence and then deleted every one of them. Only Tyler's message stayed. "I'm sorry for last night. I know they went too far." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my grandmother's old notebook, the one she had given me in college. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but her handwriting still looked steady. Tucked between the pages was a small card I had never noticed before. It was dated years earlier and said simply, "What you cultivate is yours." The words were unmistakably hers, written in that looping script. I traced my thumb over the ink, the thought forming before I even realized it. My parents had told me I was never mentioned in the will, but what if that wasn't true? The question followed me for days, turning over in my mind like a stone I couldn't set down. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. June had always been deliberate with her choices. She had promised me once in that quiet way of hers that the house would someday be mine. I remembered her exact words, how she said I would know what to do with it. It didn't sound like a sentiment you forget when writing a will. I finally took a half day from work and booked a flight back to Boston. When I landed, the wind coming off the harbor cut straight through my coat. I walked the few blocks to the probate office near the city center, a narrow brick building with worn marble steps. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. A receptionist handed me a form, her voice flat and practiced. "Fill out what you can, and we'll see if there's a record." I wrote my grandmother's name carefully across the top and slid the paper back. After a short wait, she returned with a slim file. "These are the documents on record," she said. My pulse quickened as I turned the pages. There were 2 wills inside, one older and one newer. The most recent was dated only a few weeks before June's death. My eyes caught on the line near the middle. I leave the Maple Street house and its contents to my granddaughter, Nora Whitman, who has always cherished this home. I read it again, my vision blurring until the letters swam. She had written my name. She had meant every promise she'd ever made. But beneath that will lay another older version, one that left everything to my mother and father. That older document was the one they had submitted to the court. I asked the clerk, my voice unsteady, "Was this newer one ever processed?" She shook her head. "No record of it. Only the first was filed." The air in the room seemed to thicken. I thanked her, clutching the file as I stepped outside. The cold air hit my face like a slap. They hadn't just ignored my grandmother's wishes, they had buried them. The next stop was the county courthouse. I requested the official probate record and scanned the copy they handed over. My parents' signatures appeared beside a notarized transfer deed, but even at a glance, something felt off. The signature labeled as my grandmother's was shaky, uneven, nothing like the steady, graceful script I knew. The notary's name was blurred, the stamp barely visible. I stared at it until my vision burned. By the time I reached the steps outside, the sky had turned pale with late afternoon light. People hurried past their coats, flapping in the wind, but I couldn't move. Every memory I'd ever tried to excuse the funeral, I wasn't told about the curt phone calls. The distant silences suddenly fell into place. It wasn't neglect. It was deceit, deliberate and complete. I sat there for nearly an hour before I could bring myself to act. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I searched for local estate attorneys. The name that caught my eye was Richard Hale, a partner at a small firm that specialized in inheritance disputes. I dialed his number. When he answered, his voice was calm and even, the kind of tone that carried quiet authority. "Hale and Associates," he said. I took a breath. "My name is Nora Whitman. I believe my grandmother's will was replaced with an older one after she passed." He was silent for a moment. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes," I said. 2 versions of her will, and what looks like a forged transfer deed." His tone shifted, measured but serious. "That's not just a family dispute, Ms. Whitman. That could qualify as fraud. Bring the documents to my office tomorrow morning and we'll take it from there." When I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from something that felt dangerously close to resolve. The next morning, I arrived at his office carrying the file, the original documents, and copies of my grandmother's letters. The reception area was quiet, except for the low hum of a heater. Richard Hale greeted me himself, a tall man with gray at his temples and clear, steady eyes. He read through the papers slowly, occasionally asking a short question. When he finally looked up, he folded his hands together. "This is strong evidence," he said. "The newer will leaves the property to you. The older one, the one your parents used, was likely submitted fraudulently. If the signature on this transfer deed was forged, they could face criminal penalties in addition to civil ones." He paused, studying me. "I can file a motion to reopen the estate, but we'll need to verify that the newer will was written and signed properly. Do you know of anyone who can confirm your grandmother's intentions?" I nodded. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kent, was close to her, and her pastor, Reverend Collins, at First Street Church, he might remember. "Good," he said. "Start there. The more people who can testify that your grandmother expressed her wishes clearly, the stronger your case will be." Leaving the office, I felt a strange mix of calm and adrenaline. The city around me moved at its usual pace, cars honking, people rushing to lunch, but everything seemed sharper, clearer. For the first time since my grandmother's death, I had direction. I started that afternoon. Mrs. Kent met me at her porch wrapped in a wool cardigan. When I told her what I'd discovered, she pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh, Nora, she talked about you all the time," she said. "She told me that house was yours, said you were the only one who'd care for it the way she did. She agreed to write a statement and even promised to appear if needed." Next, I visited Reverend Collins, a soft-spoken man with silver hair. He remembered June well. "She mentioned updating her will that fall," he said thoughtfully. "Told me she wanted to be sure it went to you. She worried the others wouldn't understand." His words steadied me more than he could have known. Over the next few days, I gathered letters, emails, and old records from her accountant, each piece confirming the same truth. The evidence built like a wall behind me, something solid enough to lean on. That weekend, I returned to the Maple Street house. The air was cold, and frost had formed along the porch rails. Inside, the rooms were still bare, but I could almost hear the faint creak of floorboards beneath June's careful steps. I walked from room to room, running my hand over the old wood, the faded wallpaper, the piano still standing in its corner. I knelt by the window where sunlight filtered through the glass, warming the floorboards. "We're getting there," I whispered. The words weren't meant for anyone to hear. That night, I opened June's notebook again. On a fresh page, I wrote in clear, steady letters, "Step 1, find the truth." I underlined it twice, then closed the cover. The next step would be harder, but it no longer scared me. I had lived too long in their silence. It was time to let the truth speak for itself. Outside, the cold wind carried the faint scent of smoke from nearby chimneys. Somewhere far down Maple Street, a dog barked once, and the world felt steady again. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't turning back. The weeks that followed felt like walking through two separate worlds. During the day, I was the architect in Chicago, running projects and checking budgets as if nothing had changed. At night, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by folders, statements, and printed emails, piecing together the truth my parents had buried. Richard called twice a week for updates. Each time, his voice carried a calm precision that steadied me. "We have enough to reopen the estate," he said one evening. "But once we do, there's no turning back." I understood. The quiet part of my life was over. By early winter, the evidence file was thick enough to fill a briefcase. There were signed statements from Mrs. Kent and Reverend Collins, and even an archived email from my grandmother's accountant confirming that she had amended her will to leave the house to me. Richard laid the documents across his desk, aligning each page carefully. They used the older will and a forged deed, he said. "This case is clear. We'll move forward with a petition to invalidate the transfer." His certainty was a kind of light in itself. When the filing went through, a hearing date was set for late February. Until then, there was nothing to do but wait and prepare. I spent most weekends in Boston, staying at a small inn not far from Maple Street. Each Saturday morning, I drove to the house, letting myself in with the old brass key I'd found hidden under the porch rail. The rooms were still quiet, but they no longer felt empty. I had started the slow process of restoring it, patching plaster, sanding door frames, washing the last of the dust from the windows. The rhythm of it soothed me in a way nothing else could. One morning, a thin frost glazed the garden, catching the sun like tiny shards of glass. I stood by the porch, scattering sunflower seeds across the soil where my grandmother used to plant hers. "You said they always find the light," I murmured. My breath turned white in the air. That small act, planting what she loved, felt like a promise kept. In the evenings, I would sit by the piano in the front room. Its wood was scratched and dull, but when I pressed a single key, the sound still carried through the space, soft and uneven, like a heartbeat. Each note seemed to loosen the weight I'd been carrying since the funeral I was never allowed to attend. The house was becoming what it once was, a place that breathed, a place that remembered. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, Boston was caught in a steady rain. The courthouse steps were slick underfoot, the air heavy with that damp, salt-soaked chill that clings to the coast in late winter. Inside, fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over everything. I sat beside Richard at the long wooden table, my palms resting flat against the cool surface. Across the aisle, my parents and Lauren sat together with their attorney, a man in a crisp gray suit who kept adjusting his tie. Tyler wasn't there. I didn't know if that was his choice or theirs. The judge entered, her expression calm and unreadable. After the usual formalities, my parents' lawyer began. He spoke about confusion about timing, about how the family had simply relied on the document they believed to be valid. Every word sounded rehearsed, carefully chosen to blur intent. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue at the right moments. My father sat rigid, jaw clenched, while Lauren stared straight ahead. When it was Richard's turn, he stood slowly, the weight of years of experience in his measured movements. "Your Honor," he said. This was not confusion, it was concealment. He lifted the folder in his hand and opened it deliberately. The defendants submitted an outdated will, despite knowing there was a newer version. They supported it with a falsified transfer deed. "We have proof that the notary's signature is fraudulent and testimony confirming that the deceased explicitly stated her intent to leave the property to her granddaughter." He called the notary first. The woman, middle-aged and firm-voiced, confirmed under oath that she had not signed or stamped the document attached to my parents' filing. "That page was never mine," she said. "The signature is an imitation." A ripple of sound moved through the courtroom. My mother's face drained of color. Next, Richard presented the email from my grandmother's accountant. The judge read it silently, then nodded once. "Dated 1 week before her passing," she said. Her tone had changed. Finally, he handed the judge a sealed envelope, a letter my grandmother had written in her own hand, found tucked inside her old journal. I hadn't seen it before that day. Richard had held it back, saving it for the moment that mattered most. He read it aloud. "Nora, if you're reading this, it means I've gone. I want you to have this house. You were the only one who ever loved it for what it is. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words hung in the air, simple and steady. I felt my throat tighten, my hands clenching together in my lap. Across the room, Lauren's composure cracked for the first time. My father shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the table, while my mother's hand trembled where it held the tissue. The opposing attorney rose again, trying to salvage what was left. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "there's no proof that letter was meant as a legal document." The judge held up her hand. "Enough. I've heard enough." She looked down at the papers spread before her, then spoke with a firmness that cut through the silence. "The evidence clearly shows that the valid will is the one dated October 14th, which leaves the Maple Street property to Ms. Nora Whitman. The earlier will and subsequent transfer are void. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman are ordered to cover all legal costs and damages for fraudulent submission of estate documents." For a moment, the sound of the gavel was the only thing that existed. My parents didn't look at me as the judge rose from her seat. Lauren gathered her bag in silence, her face pale. They walked out without a word. I stayed seated until the room emptied. Only then did I exhale. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still overcast, but a thin light broke through, faint and unwavering. Richard clasped my shoulder as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. "It's over," he said. I nodded, though it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something quieter, a truth settling into place after years of being buried. That evening, I drove back to Maple Street. The lights in the house were dim, but the air inside was warm from the new heating system I'd installed. I walked through each room, touching the door frames, the walls, the piano keys. The house was mine not by inheritance, but by effort, by endurance. I stood on the porch as the wind rustled through the bare branches. Somewhere down the street, a window light flickered on and the sound of laughter drifted faintly through the dusk. I thought of June, of her quiet strength, of how she taught me to stand still even when the world tilted. The weight in my chest eased. I stayed there a long while, watching the sky fade from gray to blue. Tomorrow the news would spread and the family's silence would follow. But tonight there was peace, one I hadn't known in years. The truth had spoken for itself, and that was enough. When I finally locked the front door, the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the hallway. It felt like her way of saying, "You did it." The weeks after the court's ruling passed in a quiet rhythm. Winter melted into early spring, and the house on Maple Street began to change shape. The contractors came first, men with tool belts, radios, and steady hands, fixing the roof, repainting the trim, and restoring the porch rail that had split from age. I'd visit each morning before work, stepping through rooms filled with sunlight and the faint smell of sawdust. The place felt alive again, like it was breathing after years of holding its breath. Inside, I'd moved the piano back to its corner and cleared the last boxes that had been left untouched since the trial. Every sound, the tap of hammer, the brush of a broom, echoed through the rooms in a way that reminded me of June's voice, soft but certain. When the last plank was nailed and the final coat of paint dried, I stood in the doorway and realized the house looked almost exactly as it had when I was a child. The neighbors noticed the change, too. Mrs. Kent stopped by with a pie one afternoon, her eyes bright. "She'd be proud of you, Nora," she said, setting the dish on the counter. "The place looks like it used to warm." I thanked her, though words barely covered what I felt. Later, as the sun dropped behind the trees, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the faint hum of the city in the distance. It was the first time I'd felt peace without waiting for it to end. A week later, Richard called. "The press got wind of the case," he said. "Local outlets are covering it: inheritance fraud, forged documents, family fallout. I thought you'd want to know." I did. Not for the attention, but for the truth finally finding daylight. Within days, the story appeared online, headlined simply, "Judge Rules in Favor of Granddaughter in Estate Dispute." The article quoted the court's decision and listed the evidence: 2 wills, 1 forged deed, and the recovered letter from my grandmother. It didn't mention names beyond mine, but it was enough for anyone who knew us to understand. Calls and emails followed, most from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some offered quiet congratulations. Others asked for details I had no interest in sharing. I answered few of them. My parents didn't reach out, though word about them spread quickly through their circle. My mother's volunteer boards voted her out quietly, citing personal matters. My father stepped down from his local business council. Lauren's law firm issued a statement about her taking personal leave. The silence from their side of the family was complete. One afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address, the kind of stationery my sister always used. I held it for a long moment before opening it. Inside, Lauren's handwriting filled a single page. "Nora, I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you an apology. I knew about the will. I didn't sign anything, but I kept quiet because I thought it would keep the family together. I see now it did the opposite. The truth was yours from the start. I'm sorry for not standing with you when it mattered. I hope you find peace in that house. Maybe one day you'll let me see it again. Lauren." I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and set it aside. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. I placed the letter in my grandmother's notebook between the pages of her old garden sketches. That felt like the right place for it to rest. When spring settled fully, I decided to hold a small gathering at the house. Nothing formal, just a quiet evening with the people who had helped me through it all. Mrs. Kent came early, bringing lemon cookies. Reverend Collins stopped by after service, his hands still faintly stained with soil from the church garden. Even Richard came, suit jacket traded for a soft gray sweater. The house filled with gentle conversation, the kind that doesn't need effort to sustain. As the evening light faded, I walked them through the rooms, pointing out the details I'd restored: the polished floors, the mended banister, the garden outside, already pushing up green shoots where sunflowers would soon bloom. They listened kindly, admiring without pity. When they left, each one touched my arm or shoulder, small gestures that said more than words. After they were gone, I stayed by the piano. The night outside was still, moonlight pooling across the floorboards. I pressed one key, then another, until a familiar melody began to form, a slow, uneven waltz my grandmother had played on quiet afternoons. The notes echoed through the house, reaching every corner. For the first time, it didn't sound lonely. A few days later, Tyler showed up at the door. I hadn't seen him since the trial. He stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, looking smaller somehow. "Hey," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where June used to write grocery lists and balance her checkbook. He looked around, eyes softening. "I forgot how much this place smelled like her," he said. I poured us coffee and waited. After a long pause, he said, "They're not doing great. Mom doesn't go out much anymore. Dad's angry at everyone. Lauren's in therapy, which is probably a good thing." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I just wanted to tell you I'm proud of you, Nora. You did the right thing. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I should have spoken up." I met his eyes. "You were caught in the middle," I said quietly. "That's not an easy place to be." He smiled faintly. "Still, thank you for not hating me." When he left later that evening, I stood on the porch watching him walk down the street, shoulders bent against the wind. Something about his visit settled the last bit of unease I'd been holding. The following week, I received the official court copy of the restored deed in the mail, my name printed cleanly across the page. I framed it in a small wooden frame and hung it just inside the hallway. Not as a trophy, but as proof that truth once spoken can't be taken back. That night, I sat outside under the porch light. The garden was beginning to bloom, a scatter of new green reaching through the soil. The air smelled faintly of earth and the promise of summer. For the first time in years, the house wasn't a burden or a secret. It was home. As the light faded, I thought of my grandmother's words, how she said a garden always finds its light. I believed her now. The same was true of people. The truth might stay buried for a while, but eventually it pushes through. In a few days, I would meet with Richard to finalize the foundation paperwork, the project I'd been quietly building behind all of this. It was meant to help families like mine, people who had been cut out of what was rightfully theirs. The idea had started as a whisper, but now it was something real. I turned off the porch light and stepped inside the house, settling softly around me. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to start it. Spring gave way to early summer, and the Maple Street house no longer looked like a place trying to remember who it used to be. Fresh paint glowed in the sunlight, new shutters framed the windows, and the garden stretched wide and alive again. Every morning I'd step outside with coffee in hand and watch the sunflowers lift their faces toward the light. The house no longer carried silence, it hummed with purpose. The foundation paperwork went through faster than I expected. We named it the Alder Fund after June, and its mission was simple: to help families protect what's rightfully theirs, homes, inheritances, and the kind of dignity that shouldn't require wealth to defend. Richard offered to serve on the advisory board, and Mrs. Kent became our first community volunteer. I worked late most nights drafting the plans for a small office space downtown, but it never felt like work. It felt like continuation, June's quiet lessons made visible in the world. One Saturday afternoon, I hosted a small open house to mark the start of the fund. Neighbors wandered in with cookies and coffee, asking about the new program. I'd expected the day to stay light and simple, but near the end, a familiar car pulled up across the street. My parents stepped out slowly, uncertain, as if they were approaching someone else's door. My mother carried a small bouquet of lavender. My father held his hat in his hands. They didn't ask to come in right away. We stood on the porch, the same porch where everything between us had begun to unravel years ago. My mother looked around, her eyes tracing the house she once called hers. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You did what I couldn't." My father nodded, his voice low. "We read about the foundation. It's good work." The words hung there, fragile but real. There wasn't an apology in what they said, not fully, but there was something that mattered more: acknowledgement. The sharpness that once filled every exchange between us was gone. We talked for a few minutes about the repairs, about the neighborhood, about Tyler's new job in Vermont. When they finally turned to leave, my mother paused. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said, glancing toward the garden. I nodded. "She does," I said quietly. She smiled at that, and for the first time in a long while, it reached her eyes. After they drove away, I walked out to the garden. The sunflowers had grown taller than my shoulders, now their leaves brushing against my arm as I passed. At the center of the garden stood a small wooden bench, the same one June used to sit on when she taught me how to listen for bees instead of swatting them away. I sat there feeling the warmth of the day sink into my skin and thought about everything it had taken to reach this moment. Justice hadn't come through shouting or revenge. It had come through patience, truth, and the steady belief that what's right doesn't vanish just because someone tries to cover it up. The house wasn't just mine, it was a promise restored. Every board, every nail, every blooming stem carried a piece of that truth. As dusk settled, I lit the porch lantern and watched its soft glow spill across the steps. The air smelled faintly of rain and lavender, the same scent that once filled June's kitchen. I imagined her there for a moment, sitting at the piano humming that slow waltz she always played when the day wound down. I don't know what will come next. Maybe the foundation will grow. Maybe I'll design more spaces that give others the peace I found here. But I know this: I'm no longer defined by what my family took from me. I'm defined by what I chose to build afterward. If you've ever been through something that made you question your worth, I hope you find your version of this house, a place, a purpose, a truth that no one can take. Because sometimes healing doesn't come as a grand moment. It comes as quiet mornings, the smell of coffee and sunlight through an open window, reminding you that you made it through. Thanks for listening to my story. If it spoke to something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself can be quiet, firm, and kind all at once. And if you ever doubt that truth wins in the end, just look toward the light. It always finds a way.